Welcome to Vietnam and the Crisis of Confidence, 1953 to 1980. This is Melinda Klein. Beginning in the 1940s, the United States became interested in supporting an anti-communist government in Vietnam. President Kennedy increased American involvement in the region, but after his assassination, top U.S. advisors argued that a full-scale deployment was needed in order to prevent the defeat of the South Vietnamese. President Johnson later moved forward with Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing campaign that failed to incapacitate the North Vietnamese. Approximately 2.8 million Americans served in Vietnam. The average age was 19 years old. Until the draft was repealed in 1973, many young American men were drafted to fight a war they often did not support. Black and white sons of poor and working class families shouldered a disproportionate amount of the fighting. Meanwhile, young men from more affluent backgrounds avoided the draft through attending college, medical exemptions, and appointments to the National Guard. While many citizens tried to make a more democratic government, a very different movement was taking place. The hippie symbolized this new movement, which glorified the rejection of political, social, and cultural norms. Cold War policy created conditions that led to the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese struggled for independence against the Japanese and then the French in Indochina. Vietnam was once a part of a French colony, but it was occupied by Japan during World War II. After 1945, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh proclaimed Vietnam to be an independent nation. In 1950, Soviet and Japanese leaders recognized Ho Chi Minh's republic in Vietnam. Because France was a NATO ally, the United States and Great Britain recognized the French-installed government. Truman and Eisenhower provided military support to the French in Vietnam. Eisenhower argued that aid was necessary in order to prevent non-communist governments for collapsing in a domino effect. On December 1, 1969, the U.S. began a new method of drafting young men to fight the war in Vietnam. It held a lottery. Over the course of the entire Vietnam War, draftees stood at 38% of serving in Vietnam itself. However, soldiers who belonged to this percentage were statistically more likely to die in combat than soldiers who volunteered. President Johnson knew that he needed congressional support or a declaration of war to commit U.S. troops to an offensive strategy, so he used a deceptive method to secure it. First was a controlled bombing effort known as Operation Rolling Thunder, the first of 3 sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. The second was the Tet Offensive, a series of operational offenses during the Vietnam War. Yes, the U.S. government had the most advanced weapons and technology available to fight this war, but winning the war was also another story. President Johnson believed that this superiority, also in personnel and support, would contribute to winning the war in total. However, the psychological dimensions of booby traps combined with an unseen enemy greatly affected troop movements and created feelings of helplessness and danger everywhere. The morality of U.S. conduct of the war was a major political issue. First, there was a question whether a proxy war like Vietnam without a clear and decisive path to victory was worth fighting and worth the casualties sustained both by the combatants and by civilians. In April 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia, attacking North Vietnamese and Viet Cong bases and supply lines. By May 1970, Nixon tells military officials that while the administration will continue to say that the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia is limited to supporting South Vietnamese forces in order to protect U.S. troops, the U.S. will continue its covert operations in Cambodia. In the summer of 1969, NASA fulfilled John F. Kennedy's bold promise to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Moon missions in the years that followed Apollo 11 promoted the growth of computer technology and other innovations such as fireproof clothing and better navigation systems for jet airliners. The term hippie refers to a subculture of the 1960s that began in the United States, becoming an established social order by 1965, but declining in the 1970s. Hippies, along with the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement, are considered the three dissenting groups of the 1960s counterculture movement. From the 1950s to the 1970s, U.S. culture changed. The influx to universities educated ex-servicemen and women able to go to college with the GI Bill. Not just the educated masses, but average people created change too, like Rosa Parks and others involved in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In May 1968, France experienced a political and social upheaval that shook the state to its foundations. By the 1960s, there were strong anti-war movements. On November 1969, hundreds of thousands of people rallied in New York, Boston, Washington, and other cities to demand the immediate removal of all U.S. troops from Vietnam. Kent State is sadly remembered as one of these events. By 1973, Nixon had been reelected. By early 1974, the nation was consumed by Watergate. The term Watergate refers to a series of events spanning from 1972 to 74 that gained its name from burglaries of the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate Complex Hotel in Washington, D.C. The Vietnam War was the major conflict during the Cold War, during a nuclear arms race marked by ideological differences between communism and democracy. By 1973, a treaty between North and South Vietnam ended U.S. involvement, but peace was short-lived. In 1975, the southern capital was overtaken by Northern troops. In all, 58,000 Americans lost their lives in the Vietnam War. As the United States came into the 1970s, they had a new growing concern: obtaining oil for industry and gasoline for the growing number of automobiles. During the conflicts in 1973 and U.S. involvement in Israeli-Egyptian-Arab conflicts, the Arab oil-producing countries voted to embargo oil shipments to the Netherlands and the United States. This slide illustrates and outlines major points and transition to a new presidential era, the 1980s. The top three on the list was hyperinflation, high working class unemployment, and record-setting high interest rates. In tough economic times, the new president, Ronald Reagan, had promised something new for Americans.